in Hebrew with us, within earshot of the people on the wall. This is very important. What this tells us is that for the people who are in the government, they need to know Aramaic to have international relations with the people around them who are speaking that language. But the main rank and file Judahite does not speak Aramaic. They're still speaking Hebrew. They don't want them to speak in Hebrew because the people who are gathered outside by the thousands are going to get all upset. That now you're talking about maybe surrendering to 185,000 Assyrians, right? So no, we don't want to lose heart. So please don't speak to us in Hebrew where people are going to despair. Speak to us in Aramaic, for we understand it. Okay? So at that particular point, and you can also read this, by the way, the prophet Isaiah talks about this as well. In his 36th chapter, verse 11, speak to us in Aramaic, for we understand it, but do not speak to us in Hebrew. The text actually says Judean, which is understood to mean Hebrew. Now, after that, the prophet Jeremiah writes a whole sentence in Aramaic. He basically uses the Aramaic form for God. As we know, if you want to say God, you're going to say El, Eloah, or Elohim. Mostly, you're going to say Elohim, right? But Jeremiah uses the same word for God that Daniel, who is in Babylon, uses. Elah. That is the Aramaic term. And his whole sentence is in Aramaic. Right? So, and why is that? Because in Jeremiah's own lifetime, they get exiled to, the Judeans get exiled to an Aramaic-speaking country in Babylon, and he writes a letter to them. So he's going to express things to them in a language they understand. Is this making sense? Everyone still with me? Did someone have,
What scripture was that in Jeremiah?
10 verse 11. Did someone else have a question?
Well, it's kind of off subject, but the Muslims use the word Allah. Similar, is that where they get it from? Allah?
Yes and no. Let me tell you what Arabic does. It might not be surprising to learn that Arabic likes to chop off parts of Aramaic. Okay, that's literally. I'm not being facetious. What they tend to do is, like, if we have a word in Aramaic for light, that's nurah, where you get menorah, right? Did you know that menorah means from light, right? Well, they will take the ah and make it Noor. Like you have Queen Noor of Jordan, right? That's where her name comes from. And similarly, this idea that Muhammad was the first monotheist to like go into Arabia is total fiction. There were Jews and Christians in Saudi Arabia hundreds and hundreds of years before Muhammad was born, okay? And so what happened is, when the words of the Bible came into the Arabic dialect, instead of saying Eloah, which is the singular form of Elohim, Eloah, or Aramaic would more say Allah, and they took the Allah and cut off that last ah, and you're left with Allah. You see, that's how that happened. However, it is also important to note that there was a deity named Allah who was the moon god. So some scholars are going to say, linguistics aside, that what happened was there were 360 idols in that Kaaba stone, that big black thing that the Muslims march around in Mecca, and that Muhammad got rid of 359 of those 360. And because he had his night journey by the crescent moon, he made the moon god supreme. That's what some scholars say. I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying this is what I've read. Okay? So there's two different opinions. Some will say that it's the moon god Allah that is the god of the Quran. Others will say no, it's a linguistic process where they simply chopped off the last ah of the Aramaic form for God. Take your pick. So, yes, you had a question?
So Syrians speak Aramaic?
Yes.
Okay.
Not today they don't, but they did.
There's the one in Deuteronomy where it says, he was Syrian.
Well, it says Arami in the Hebrew, and some translations will say Syrian, but
Translation, is it a mistranslation to say Syrian?
it is a less clear choice to say Syrian. Arami most naturally becomes Aramean in English. So you kind of want to keep as much of that word as you can if there is a valid alternative. And instead of saying Syrian, you'll say Aramean, because that's what the E is doing in Hebrew anyway.
So when we see Syrian in our translation,
it's not my choice.
you can't assume that it's an Aramean?
Oh yeah, because if you read in the scriptures, when they name the places in Syria, you get the Beit Naharin and Aramayin and all of these other Aram. The Aramaic is the language of the people who are descended from Aram. And the Aramites, for lack of a better term, all of them were in Syria.
Okay.
So, and scholars to this day will also sometimes call Aramaic Syriac, from Syria, you see? But the problem that I have with that is it makes it sound like the language started in Syria, and it kind of cuts it off from its Jewish origin that we've been discussing. So it's not as historically helpful as to say Aramean, because Aramean again comes from Aram, and that covers all of it. Does that make sense?
Another question. Question you don't have to answer it complete now, but this one put up there, the Peshitta.
The Peshitta.
Peshitta. I have one and I love it.
Thank you. Okay.
I prefer it over all of them.
Well, that's what I translate from. From the Eastern Peshitta text, which, we're going to get to that a little later. Okay. So, what I think we'll end up doing is, because I can see that clock over there, we're going to go through the rest of the Aramaic and the Tanakh and probably go get lunch, and then we'll talk about the Peshitta and the Aramaic text of the New Testament. But in any case, the last part of the script of the Tanakh, the writings, okay? We now have the kingdom of Judah in captivity in Babylon. Jerusalem and her temple destroyed, and they are taken into Babylon, where they lived for 70 years in an Aramaic-speaking country. How do I know that? You can read Daniel 2, verse 4. Where it clearly says that the king of Babylon received communication in Aramaic. Some will say Chaldean. That's another slightly inaccurate way to talk about Aramaic. Because the Chaldeans all spoke Aramaic. It's not like some of them were speaking Greek and some of them were doing Portuguese, and only this was doing, the Aramaic language. Then in 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. And Persia is another Aramaic-speaking country. So are we seeing that the Hebrew people are having extended contact? They're in captivity for generations at a shot. Sometimes they like it so much they stay by choice. So what language are they learning? Aramaic, right? And you can also see proof of Persia as an Aramaic-speaking country in Ezra 4, verse 7. Okay. Then in 516 BC, 70 years of captivity in Babylon ends, and Jews are coming from both Babylon and from Persia under Ezra to come back to Jerusalem to rededicate the temple in February of 516 BCE. Okay? Now, this is a very important scripture I'm going to read from the book of Nehemiah, okay, chapter 8. So now you have all these Aramaic exiles flooding into Jerusalem. And there's Ezra, the national hero, the chief priest of Babylon. And they get him up there, and this is what happens when he addresses these throngs of exiles. Nehemiah 8. Then all the people gathered together as one in the courtyard before the water gate. And they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the Torah of Moshe, which Yahweh had commanded to Israel. So that scroll, that's like 1,000 years of history right there that have been maintained right up to Ezra's time, which is what we were talking about previously. So Ezra the priest brought the Torah before the congregation, men and women and all those who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. So, happy Yom Teruah, right? He read from the front of the courtyard, that is in front of the water gate, from the first light until midday, in the presence of the men and women and those who understood, and in the ears of all the people, they were attentive to the Torah scroll. Ezra the scribe stood on a wooden tower that they had made for the purpose. Next to him stood Mattaniah, together with Pedaiah, Mishael, Malchiah, Kashum, Hashbaddah, Zechariah, and Meshullam. Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, being above Yahweh, the great Elohim. And all the people said, Amen, Amen, with their hands raised. Then they bowed and prostrated themselves to Yahweh, faces to the ground. Yeshua, Bani, Sharifyah, Yamin, Akuf, Shabbatai, Hodiah, Maaseiah, Kelita, and Azariah, Yozavad, Hanan, and Pelita, and the Levites helped the people understand the Torah. While the people stood in their place, they read in the scroll in Elohim's Torah clearly and added its interpretation. And they helped the people understand the reading. Now, again, what was the language of the countries these people were from? Aramaic. So what were they speaking when they gathered in Jerusalem? Aramaic. Because we know, why isn't it Hebrew? Because we just told they needed help understanding it. Isn't that what I just read?
They spoke Hebrew.
Ezra interpreted the Hebrew Torah into the Aramaic language for the benefit of the exiles. That's what it says. So therefore, this is how we know that Aramaic had really arrived not just as a language, but as the predominant language of the Jewish people. Not that Hebrew was forgotten, because I could see that question coming up in people's eyes. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? But Hebrew was increasingly becoming a language that needed interpretation, which means you needed these things we call, what's the word? Synagogues. That's what the synagogues are for. Okay? So, this is why, where do I get this idea? Well, over the next 2 centuries from Ezra's time, the rest of the Tanakh canon is completed, and books were done in Aramaic to reflect the language of the exiles that have returned. 1/3 of Daniel is in Aramaic. 1/3 of the book of Ezra is in Aramaic. The most ancient Jewish prayers that have come down to us from 2,400 years ago, the Amida prayer, Aramaic. Your marriage text, your ketubah text, also from 400 BC, also in Aramaic. Kaddish, Aramaic. Aramaic becomes so important that the Jews who are left behind in Babylon, because 90% of them didn't go back up to Judah, they composed something called the Peshitta Tanakh. The Peshitta Tanakh, the Peshitta Old Testament, Aramaic. That's done about 50 BC, right? And let me tell you something about that Peshitta Tanakh. Those manuscripts are 500 years older than the oldest extant Hebrew text that we have for like Aleppo and Leningrad. They are 500 years older than that. And I'm not just talking little fragments here and there, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay? So, it's not that Hebrew ever went away. It's not that Hebrew was devalued. It's not that Hebrew was disregarded. But for the people who had come through exile, Aramaic was the language that they were speaking while they were working in their houses, in their families. Hebrew was the language of the synagogue.
Do you think anything was lost in the translation from the Hebrew to Aramaic?
No. No. And I'll tell you why. Because I can look at the manuscripts myself, I can tell you that the best friend the Masoretic text has are these Aramaic manuscripts that preceded her. Okay? So I go letter for letter, line for line, and it is the same.
Do you think that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic then before translated to the Greek?
Well, see, that's part 2.
So Aramaic was translated to Hebrew then?
I'm sorry?
So it was written in Aramaic, translated to Hebrew.
What was written in Aramaic and translated to Hebrew?
The older text, the Torah.
No, the Torah was originally written in Hebrew.
Yeah, okay.
And then it was translated into Aramaic in around the 1st century BC. Okay? We don't know the exact year. Okay, so Aramaic, another thing that happens is something called the Targums, or the interpretations. Again, these are for Jews in Israel. You get, one Targum is called Onkelos, that's the authoritative interpretation of the Torah. Another is called Jonathan, which is the authoritative one for the prophets, okay? And these Targums arose because the Jews in Israel were having a hard time understanding what the Hebrew meant. So it's to help the Hebrew, it's to preserve the Hebrew in a sense, but it's also, listen, I understand this better in my Aramaic dialect. And that's why the Targums came about. And that's why about 20% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Aramaic, 70% in Hebrew. And the remainder, you have a few that are in Greek and maybe one even in Latin, if I'm remembering correctly. Right? You have synagogue and cemetery inscriptions that have been found all over Israel from this period. They are in Aramaic. Let me give you one example of how thoroughly Aramaic has embedded itself into Jewish thought, and then we can break for lunch. Okay? Now, when I turned 13 years old, as a Jewish kid, what do I go through? A bar mitzvah. Right, except, shouldn't it be a ben mitzvah?
Yeah.
Where does the word bar come from? Take a wild guess. Where does the word bar come from?
Aramaic.
Aramaic, bar none. Okay? So, if it's a thoroughly Hebrew term, why aren't we going to a ben mitzvah? Right? When I would be sick, my mother wouldn't feel my reshe, which is the Hebrew word for head. She'd feel my kepi. That's where you get the name for Peter, kifa, Aramaic. Jewish people have been speaking Aramaic, whether they realize it or not, for thousands and thousands of years. It has become so effortless that we toggle between the two languages without even realizing it, because these letters look the same. When I'm reading this, it's not like I get a warning sign going, warning, you are approaching the other language of Aramaic, beware, right? So, when it becomes like that, when even the Jewish people themselves don't always know when they're speaking one and speaking the other, is it any wonder that this could be confusing to everyone else? And that's kind of my point. So, coming up in part 2, We're going to look at the Aramaic origins, in some cases, of the New Testament without bashing the Greek at all. The Greek, I love the Greek. Okay, the Greek does a wonderful service, but sometimes the Greek needs a lot of help. Okay, so I'm going to show you how the Aramaic and the Greek work together to preserve Father Yah's word for the benefit of everybody. Until then, toda rabah for your kind attention. That's it.
I've got one question, we can address this later. In
Okay,
Acts 22, the Apostle Paul, he stood up to speak, he spoke in the Hebrew tongue, and they
yes.
listened. Was that Hebrew or Aramaic?
Well, scholars are divided on that. A lot of times what we call the dialectos Hebraidi refers to the Aramaic dialect, not Hebrew. And the reason is, if I am Hebrew, why do you need to say the Hebrew dialect? Wouldn't it be assumed a Hebrew would speak, Hebrew? Right? So most scholars believe that those references are referring to the Aramaic dialect that the Hebrew people spoke. And a lot of translations will say that's Aramaic. One of the really interesting places where this comes up in the book of Acts, and we're going to talk about this in part 2, is Acts 1:19, where they call the place Akal Dama, or Hagel Dama, which is a thoroughly Aramaic phrase. And Acts 1:19 says, and this was the language of the country. So that, even Luke is saying that Aramaic is the predominant language, at least of the people of Jerusalem. So we'll get into all that in part 2.
All right, well, let's stand and be dismissed.